11. The death drive and ethical action. Introductory remarks. In answer to the question of how Sophocles' Antigone, a relatively neglected Athenian tragedy, so captured the ethical imagination that it has become a regular reference point for ethical speculation, Copy proposes that German idealism recharged the play by finding in it the paradigmatic universality/particularity problematic of modern ethics. 1. The abyssal complexity of Hegel's dialectic of the ethical order to which it is indexed has generated such a rich tapestry of readings that this reference point is, indeed, most likely to be Hegel's Antigone. Lacan's interpretation of the play, then, is as much a matter of finding contemporary relevance in an ancient text as it is of responding to Hegel's reinvention of Antigone as the paradigmatic figure of modern ethics. 2. Notably, agreement concerning Hegel's argument is far from assured, but to define a point of comparison with Lacan's treatment of ethical action, I shall very briefly outline Hegel's proposition that the ethical order is constituted by a dialectical opposition between the ethical principles of universality and particularity, which he calls masculine and feminine and for which Creon and Antigone stand as metonyms. The purpose of this starting point is to situate the Lacanian account of the ethical in relation to the structure of Hegel's dialectic, to which it is a critical response. This, in turn, allows one to establish an accord with the plural logic of the aporia which can be understood as the equivalent Derridean response to Hegel's dialectic. 318 Because I find it difficult, however, to empathize with Antigone's ethical obligation to bury her brother lest he wander the underworld as a wraith in perpetuity, I take Hegel's Antigone only as a point of departure, and, shifting focus to a contemporary instance of dramatic fiction that addresses more familiar ethical questions and dilemmas, I draw Alejandro Amenabar's film The Sea Inside into the discussion. In outline, Ramo en San Pedro, having existed for 28 years as a quadriplegic after a diving accident in his youth, expresses, and finally manages to act upon, an unyielding desire to end his life. In the form of characters whose intricate array of ethical stances are varied according to whether or not they support or dispute his argument for the right to an assisted suicide, and in the degree to which they are willing to act upon their convictions, the film poses the question of whether it ultimately narrates the story of criminal or ethical action. Amenabar's sympathies are clear enough, and the film might have been made expressly to stage a Lacanian challenge to the conventional morality that presides over Ramo N's existence. 3. It therefore provides a clear illustration of a theory of ethical action that is by no means easy to grasp in its rather abstruse Derridean and Lacanian formulations. Hegel's Antigone and ethical fanaticism. Hegel uses the context, characters, and events of the Antigone to exemplify and critique the ethical fanaticism that emerges as the dialectical opposite of pure reasoning in ethics. In other words, to begin with, he challenges two extremes as equally inadequate to concrete ethical decision-making. He objects to the emptiness of pure reasoning, which places individuals outside the communal discourses, institutions, politics, and requires them to make ethical judgments from this disinterested position of critical distance. Yet, through his account of the dialectical collapse of the ethical order, he also resists what one may call the fanaticism of its natural opposite, namely the turn to ethical substance. I shall take fanaticism along with Kant, ironically, to denote the kind of self-delusion that wills some vision of content beyond all the bounds of sensibility. 4. In this case, the construction of an ethical edifice rests on the mere dream that one may gain access to all there is to see on the basis of given ethical principles. Further, fanaticism involves a fixation to this dream, a refusal to give it up no matter what the cost. Hegel's diagnosis of the problematic turn to ethical substance is as follows. First, the condition under which two varieties of ethical fanaticism, 319 represented by Creon and Antigone, become possible is an immature notion of community that defines the whole as a mere aggregation of parts, or community as an aggregate of family units / private associations. On this misunderstanding of community, whole and parts are separately realized on the basis of inherently conflicting ethical principles, namely universality and particularity, neither of which alone covers all of the ethical substance. Second, because this immature notion of community already creates the structural conditions for conflict, ethical appropriation too becomes oppositional. Both Antigone and Creon understand their ethical agency as a passion. They believe themselves to be entirely possessed by or given to an ethical authority, in contemporary terms, an ideology, which opposes and supersedes whatever self-possession they may in principle be capable of by virtue of their own powers of active reasoning. The element of passion here, which was originally supposed to have tempered the arrogance of active reason, becomes a source of fanatical fixation because it takes shape as impassioned obedience to a single ethical authority, either human or divine law, which is taken to cover all there is and therefore blinds itself to the other authority, and to their paradoxical interdependence. For Hegel's Creon, accordingly, the authoritative whole that covers all there is takes shape as a positive system of human law, which is knowable in its entirety. For him human law is all-encompassing, it fills all the possible space for ethical thinking, without gaps. However, as Hegel has demonstrated, his belief that his whole is identical with the all is an impossible fantasy, a delusion, upon which action would be disastrous. For Hegel's Antigone, by direct contrast, the whole of human law only becomes all-encompassing by contingent artifice or decree. It completes itself only by externalizing what exceeds its dictates, the excess constituted by that which, in principle, cannot be made explicitly known, and by repressing this violation. It therefore will never be the all but merely a closed system, limited by an outside, a divine law, it cannot encompass. It is in principle an impossible task to take account of this unspeakable outside, which is indicated in the notion of the divine but converted into an oxymoron in the notion of a divine law. Hegel's Antigone, nevertheless, mistakenly believes that she must take account of the divine and she therefore violates its absolute externality, or alterity, precisely in its translation into specific ethical action. Ethical fanaticism, then, is the insistence on the possibility of ethical action on the basis of either of these two impossibilities. 320 Hegel's underlying dialectical strategy is to show that whenever a binary opposition is set up, the two poles cannot be separated sharply, because they are interdependent. If one side is privileged as self-sufficient, as covering all there is, and the other relegated to a derivative status, then the latter is violated, and this equally turns out to be a violation of the former. In this quintessentially modern conflict, the principles of universality and particularity stand in binary opposition, and accordingly, as Copy puts it, what makes Antigone and Creon equally guilty, in Hegel's eyes, is the fact that in choosing one course of action they thereby lose something that is not merely expendable, but that sustains, or is the necessary condition of, the very thing they choose. Antigone and Creon act on behalf of the particular and the universal, respectively, but since there is no particular without the universal, and vice versa, each choice ends in a betrayal of that in the name of which it is made. 5 To act for the whole, the community, at the cost of the part, the family, is to destroy the community too, because the family network forms the structure of the community. But to act for the part, the family, at the cost of the whole is to destroy the family too, because the family has no security or stability except as part of the whole. In short, there is no hope of acting to satisfy both authorities simultaneously, and the ethical act must become violent. The tragedy of the ethical order, then, is that the ethical deed is inherently a violation of the ethical substance. Hegel, however, views the collapse of the ethical order into self-contradiction as a necessary stage on the way to a more mature notion of community as speculative unity, which dissolves the condition for the possibility of fanaticism. For Hegel, the ethical aporia indicates a false opposition derived from misunderstanding the whole as a mere aggregation of parts, whereas the ultimately true notion of the all is the speculative unity of sameness and difference. Here, on analogy with a magnet, he envisages an organic unity in which macrocosm and microcosm mirror one another. No matter where a magnet is cut, it will never be divided into positive and negative sides. Rather, all parts, no matter how small, mirror the polarity of the whole. For Hegel, the collapse of the ethical order makes way for a higher order synthesis leading to the speculative unity that would eradicate the agraria. While rejecting Hegel's resolution, both Derrida and Lacan grant Hegel's insight concerning the aporetic relation between these binaries, and 321 accept his conclusion that ethics is impossible if either side of the opposition is hypostatized, for each ethical principle, universality or particularity, both denies and depends on the other. This claim may seem surprising on the face of it, for Lacan explicitly challenges Hegel's insistence that both Antigone and Creon are structurally guilty of equal but opposite crimes. 6 Hegel's interpretation, he insists, does not do justice to Antigone's act, which alone, and in contrast to the fixated action of a fanatical Creon, is truly ethical. This seems to imply that Lacan inconsistently makes a choice, already interdicted by his own arguments, for one side of the binary over the other. But there is a subtle line between what Lacan can be understood to be granting and challenging in Hegel's analysis of the ethical order, because, like Derrida, he is here dealing not with 2 but 3 options, which changes everything. Thus, Lacan does not have to deny Hegel's point that both masculine and feminine approaches, set up as a binary opposition, lead to ethical fanaticism in order to argue that Antigone's act surpasses the binary opposition. In other words, in his view, she escapes the feminine variety of ethical fanaticism because she challenges the intrinsic authority claimed by law as such. In her act, implicitly guided by the notion of et, she exposes the criminal being of law, that is, the notion that law, which always covers over its inherent lack, inevitably bears the trace of a necessarily violent externalization and repression of that which exceeds it. For Lacan, in contrast with Hegel, the Antigone illustrates the difference between 2 kinds of acts, the fixated mere actions of those who insist on obedience to the law, whether human or divine, and the persevering ethical action of those who are willing to transgress the law, not simply to destroy law as such, but to dismiss the absolute power claimed by any imposed law over their actions. Lacan's Antigone, then, resists the power claimed by Creon's law, not in abject obedience to a different kind of law, but in favor of her autonomous decision to cherish her love for her brother. In other words, Lacan disagrees with Hegel that Antigone is motivated by a hypostatized law or principle of particularization, and insists instead that she is motivated to act by a different kind of passion, namely the power of eros. 7 This simply means that Lacan's Antigone is not the same person as Hegel's Antigone. Hegel would, in effect, call Antigone hysterical. Resisting the very possibility of there being desire between brother and sister, he sees her act as clearly motivated by blind, dutiful obedience to the dictates of divine law. Lacan argues, by contrast, that it is precisely desire that lies between brother and sister in the Antigone, and he replaces the 322 motivation of duty with the singularity of her autonomous love for Polyuses. Whether there is sufficient textual evidence in the play to support either interpretation of her motives is not my concern here. It is hardly unknown for philosophers to bend literature, which is quintessentially multivocal, to fit the shape of a particular theory. Instead, what is philosophically important in Lacan's disagreement with Hegel concerning the status of Antigone's act is the addition of a third possibility that exceeds the binary. Lacan, then, is quite willing to concede Hegel's theoretical point that those who act in blind obedience to a principle of pure particularity may be called fanatical or hysterical. He just does not accept that this description fits Antigone. For him, Antigone, who acts out of singular, autonomous love for another, takes a different, inventive, and, in his view, genuinely ethical path that disrupts the veil of alienation. It seems to me, then, that Lacan does not go beyond Derridean undesirability when he chooses Antigone over Creon. Rather, in this choice, he chooses the agraria of paradox, and in so doing, chooses such undesirability. The Lacanian /Derridean challenge to Hegel's resolution. For Hegel, the collapse of the ethical order is an inevitable moment that makes way for a higher speculative unity that ultimately eradicates the agraria. This resolution is rejected by Lacan and Derrida on the same basis, namely that the truth is not the whole, but difference. 8 Lacan insists that there is no substantiation for a philosophy that culminates in Hegel's discourse, a plenitude of contrasts dialecticized in the idea of an historical progression, and asks instead whether the formalization of mathematical logic, which is based only on writing, would not better serve us in the analytic process. 9 Derrida similarly argues that the dialectical process of mutual negation that promises speculative unity as its telos is artificially constituted by Hegel in violent attempts to force diversity into systematic binary oppositions. Speculative unity, then, itself becomes a form of fanaticism, for to construct a single system that pretends to cover it all, Hegel has to suppress all manner of anomalies, loose ends, and indigestible fragments. In other words, the ethical order indeed collapses, but only in name of a more encompassing tyranny, for Hegel's system depends on eliminating precisely what both Derrida and Lacan aim to preserve, namely an irremediable excess, remainder, or supplement in any system. Because the introduction into Hegel that Derrida names glass ranges across Hegel's entire corpus, and Derrida's interpretation of the ethical 323 order forms just part of a monumental work of exegesis, one might imagine that he supports the contention that Hegel only makes sense when a part is read with the whole in mind, and one cannot achieve a productive reading of any developmental stage without describing spirit's entire dialectical development. 10 But glass is unreadable, except in fragments, and this is precisely its point. The whole text or corpus, for Derrida, is an inconceivable, impossible notion, and glass represents a performative challenge to anyone's claim to have the whole in mind, not least of all Hegel's. Derrida's exegesis of Hegel's text, then, is an introduction into it of shattering fragments, not only from its various outsides, for example, in its associative contiguity with the adjacent text, on pages divided into 2 columns, but also from within its own sinister columnar space. To take just one example, Derrida argues that Hegel's speculative unity is impossible because the dialectical process that promises it as its telos is artificially constituted by Hegel's violent attempts to force difference as mere diversity into difference as proper opposition. But since something is necessarily violated in this move, the dialectic will be undone by the inevitable questions this violence engenders. Reading Hegel, then, Derrida looks for the moments when diversity is forced into opposition by violent erasure of alternatives, without good enough reason. He sees the brother-sister relation, privileged by Hegel as the only ethical family relation, as just such a moment. 11 To detail the intricate arguments that underpin Hegel's privileged choice here would be to move far beyond the scope of this interjection. Suffice it to remark that his dialectic requires a proper opposition of masculine and feminine equals to represent the paradoxical antagonism and interdependence that characterizes the relation between family and community, and he bends the family structure into a shape that suits his purpose. Accordingly, he selects without justification a particular, Western, Greek, model of family life and insists that the ethical bond that ties families together to form the underlying substructure of a community obtains only in a non-desiring relation of mutual recognition between brother and sister. He remains unaccountably silent about family members other than parents, children, and siblings, as well as the matter of the relation between sisters. 12 Again, from a singular event where brothers, originally committed to power sharing, rise against each other, Hegel generalizes the monstrosity of there being more than one brother in the family. 13 The implication in both cases is that there should only ever be one sister and brother in each family. Noting the violence of this structural imposition, 324 Derrida sets his questioning loose on the text, reminding Hegel's readers not to pass too quickly over these small, indigestible fragments. Ironically, the dissatisfaction one experiences reading glass emerges from a surfeit of satisfaction. Derrida's text is as abyssal as Hegel's, but for opposite reasons. Hegel tried to realize the systematist whole that encompasses all there is, without gaps, but the very impossibility of this aim generates an endless critical response. Derrida shatters the crystalline structure of Hegel's whole into fragments, themselves limitless, which never add up to a whole. 14 again, the thinking never comes to an end, and the dissatisfaction in both cases is endemic. Facing the structural impossibility of taking it all in, however, Derrida agrees with those Lacanians who warn against becoming hysterical. Adumbrating the character of ethical action that takes shape in Lacan's account of the ethics of psychoanalysis, one may argue that for Derrida, one must not, above all, sacrifice the enjoyment of the text, snap the book shut, and entomb oneself on the outside of it. Instead, one can, with his blessing, love the fragment, the partial object, a fragment of this fragment, the one that attracts thought's desire and is sublimated in its limitless supply of compounded satisfactions. On Derrida's account, Hegel's speculative unity is impossible because the dialectical process that promises it as its telos can only be artificially constituted by violent attempts to force diversity into binary opposition. How, then, does one proceed if one wishes, along with Hegel, to get beyond ethical fanaticism without resurrecting Kant's faith in the categorical imperative, but if, against Hegel, one sees speculative unity as itself a form of fanaticism? Both Derrida and Lacan insist that ethical action is a matter of finding a way to act ethically face to face with, even because of, the inevitable a priorities that emerge from the very notion of principality itself, be it the universal force of law imposed in the name of the whole or the universal law of transgression imposed in the name of the part. Moreover, since ethical action apparently must, but cannot, be a matter of choosing one or the other side of this opposition, they agree that there must be something wrong with the binary setup. For both thinkers, what is wrong with the binary setup, then, is not the fact of the a priori, which is ineradicable, but the belief that it forces a choice between interdependent opposites. Both, then, accept the inevitability of the a priori but refuse to make the choice that destroys the possibility of ethical action. Each considers instead how ethical action nevertheless becomes possible in the negotiation of aporetic demands, that is, in the very attempt to do the impossible, to act with equal justice to both sides. Derrida best articulates the call for ethical action not in response to Hegel's Antigon but in the force of law which addresses the aporetics of ethical decision-making. It might still seem surprising to claim that 325 Lacan articulates a parallel response by aligning ethical action with feminine sublimation, given how often it is said that Derrida, following Levinas, focuses on the other, while Lacan, following Freud, focuses on the subject. But if one has learned anything from either, it surely must be a healthy suspicion of one-sided formulations, for it should be clear that for both thinkers subject and other are never uncontaminated. Instead of seeking in vain for differences, I shall argue that their accounts of ethical action concur in that both oppose such action, in principle, to any acts that simply rely on conventional morality. For both, the necessity for ethical action arises precisely when individuals are tied up in the a priori of paradox, where the obligation to act imposes itself in the absence of clear directives. On the one hand, one is compelled to act for the good without, in principle, any non-subjective means of knowing what the good is, for the good is a function of singular desire. As Lacan puts it in a discussion of Aristotelian ethics, beside the major premise, one must always taste what is sweet, there is a particular concrete minor premise, i.e., this is sweet. And the principle of wrong action is to be found in the error of a particular judgment relative to the minor premise. Where is the error to be found? Precisely in the circumstance that the desire which is subjacent to the major premise causes the wrong judgment to be made concerning the reality of the supposed sweetness toward which the action is directed. 15 To translate, subjacent to the major premise that one must always do what is good is the implied qualification that relates the good to desire, namely, if one desires the pleasure of happiness, the error of judgment concerning what the good is pertains to the relation between desire and the good. If something gives me pleasure or happiness, it is good. If acting on the basis of a subjective conflation of my desire with the good seems inimical to ethical action, acting consistently in accordance with pregiven conventions or rules, on the other hand, is equally problematic. Both Derrida and Lacan argue that an ethical act cannot be a matter of blindly applying pre-existing rules to novel situations but must be a matter of making decisions about the validity of such rules, after which there is no return, for a decision that lives up to its name implies that any rule can be suspended or transgressed. Even if it is subsequently reconfirmed, having once been suspended in order to make reconfirmation possible, it can, indeed must, always be suspended again in the future. This 326 power of distance taking, which underscores an individual's relative autonomy vis-a-vis any conventional morality, as Lacan's Antigon demonstrates, becomes the basis for ethical action. This is a point starkly illustrated in the film The Sea Inside, to which I have tied my discussion of Lacan's account of the ethics of psychoanalysis. Conventional morality as represented in The Sea Inside to be guided by the dictates of conventional morality is to be guided in ethical practice by those principles that the legal system strives to approximate as fully as possible in specific laws. The film focuses on one of these principles in particular, namely the sanctity of life. Notably, Rameau's own ethical position is ambiguous from the point of view of a conventional morality that inscribes this principle in its laws. As argued by one of the lawyers in the film, mark suicide may be inscribed in law as a criminal act, but those whose attempted suicides fail are not regularly prosecuted. Tacitly, then, while suicide may be frowned upon from an ethical or religious standpoint, law no longer stretches its reach so far as to make it a positively criminal act. Nevertheless, it will stretch to criminalize those who actively aid a suicide. The conventional morality featured in the film allows for a straightforward assessment of the film's main protagonists in terms of their moral rectitude. The question of ethical action, as I shall discuss later, is trickier. Here, the most morally untainted character turns out to be a quadriplegic priest, Francisco de Galda, whose unwavering conviction concerning the rectitude of his insistence upon the sanctity of life under any circumstances, and he should know, after all, reflects the fundamental principle of conventional morality at issue here. Moreover, by at least ostensibly considered argumentation, he sets about actively promoting the general good by publicly and privately attempting to convince Rameau that one ought to respect the sanctity of life and perhaps show gratitude by holding oneself responsible for capitalizing on what one is given, as he demonstrably tries to do. From the point of view of conventional morality, de Galda's virtue, then, lies in the fact that he tries to talk Rameau out of a frame of mind from which issues his threat to transgress one of the sacred cows of conventional morality, had he the means. Further, his proactive attitude suggests that he would have done everything in his power to save Rameau from himself had he known at any point that a crime was about to be committed. Like the priest, Rameau's brother, Jose, tries to talk him out of this transgressive frame of mind, albeit for altogether different reasons. There 327 is no indication in the film that Jose has reflected in any depth on the impersonal, metaphysical question of the sanctity of life. Instead, he requires Rameau to live, and to desire life, for only this desire, he believes, can make sense of the enormous personal sacrifice that has been required of him for the sake of Rameau's care. It is out of passionate love and anger, rather than a reasoned appropriation of conventional morality, that he rails so bitterly against Rameau's desire to die, and refuses point-blank to aid him. This motivation, while important for understanding his ethical position, is irrelevant to an assessment of his position on conventional morality's scale of virtue, for, regardless of motive, his attempts to elicit from Rameau a desire for life, while fruitless, would nonetheless also be viewed as actively promoting the general good. What taints him morally is simply that when Rameau has finally engineered the means to carry out his desire for death, Jose knows of his intentions but does nothing to stop him. At the crucial moment when he could have acted, he sits on the wall, metaphorically the fence, paralyzed by his ambivalence. His inaction, while not criminal, could be subject to moral censure. Strictly speaking, Manuela's position on the scale of conventional morality slips behind that of her husband, Jose, because she does not even attempt to talk him out of his transgressive frame of mind. In fact, her stance is altogether more ambiguous than her husband's. She has a similar motivation for desiring Ramoen's desire for life, since her own life is entirely invested in caring for him, and his loss would deprive her life of purpose. Yet, because she loves him without the anger that paralyzes her husband, she can express sympathy for his desire to die. Nevertheless, despite this sympathy, she does not encourage him to seek death, and one is tacitly made aware that she could not have brought herself to commit a crime by aiding him in his illegal quest for an aided suicide. Instead, she talks him into supporting a legal challenge to the principle that obstructs his desire, the insistence upon the absolute sanctity of life underpinning conventional morality, by encouraging him to testify in a court case. While his testimony is unlikely to help him personally, she convinces him to go ahead anyway by arguing that it could help others after him. In the end, the court case is lost, leaving conventional morality intact on the question of the sanctity of life. Again, while Manuela does not act illegally, what taints her morally is not only that she supports Ramoen's defiance of conventional morality but also that she knows of his intention to commit suicide and does nothing to stop him. Julia, the lawyer initially hired to fight Ramoen's case for the right to an aided suicide, treads a fine borderline between moral and criminal action. She knows that Ramoen is planning to commit suicide, and she promises 328 not simply to aid him but indeed to join him. Ramoen had specifically chosen her as a legal representative because she suffers from a degenerative condition characterized by periodic strokes that are progressively more debilitating. However, her promise is made in a state of fear and similarly broken, for she loses her nerve and backs out of the agreement at the last minute. Since Ramoen requires help to commit suicide, this also effectively prevents them from committing the crime. A case for criminal action could arguably be made against one of the members of the Die with Dignity Association, Jean, who instigates the legal battle to modify the sanctity of life principle, on the basis that it derives from an archaic metaphysical worldview no longer at the center of the universe. Although the case is lost, she nevertheless plays a small but active part in helping Ramoen commit suicide. However, Rosa, a young factory worker and occasional disc jockey who visits and befriends Ramoen after seeing his televised plea for the legal right to an aided suicide, is easily placed at the bottom of this scale of virtue, because she plays the decisive role in aiding his suicide, and in so doing unambiguously opens herself to the possibility of criminal charges. In sum, based on the conventional morality represented in the film, Derrida, the priest, is the only genuinely moral actor entirely uncontaminated by the crime. All of the other principal characters are implicated in one way or another and could face greater or lesser moral disapproval and even criminal charges. The most criminal of all is Rosa, who betrays her initial moral convictions concerning the sanctity of life to the extreme point of being willing to commit murder. The film, however, encourages an intuitively felt objection to these arguments, for the portrayal of Rosa engages one's sympathies, while her binary counterpart in this schema, Derrida, comes across far less agreeably. Moreover, the film audience comes to know Rosa in her quirky singularity during the course of the narrative, while the priest remains a stereotypical and peripheral caricature. In the figure of Rosa's singularity, then, the film tacitly supports an ethical discourse that challenges the generalized stereotypes inscribed in this, and any other, conventional morality, and for which both Derrida and Lacan, among many others, offer philosophical grounds. Lacan and the ethics of psychoanalysis. I cannot pretend to cover what Lacan has to say concerning the ethical. Instead, I shall tease out the broad implications of Lacan's insistence that ethical action is motivated by love rather than law. 16:1 may begin by 329 suggesting that the masculine libidinal style of ideological paranoia, associated with the death drive as an inertial drive to return to an immortal state of fullness, and the feminine libidinal style of neurotic hysteria, associated, by contrast, with an entropic desire for the dissolution of all tensional bonds, or, that is, for a state of immortal nirvana, may be set up as a binary opposition, related according to the Velavalianation in a way that closely matches Hegel's articulation of the divide between a masculine and feminine fanaticism that splits the ethical order. 17 for Lacan, ethical action is not possible within the bounds of the masculine libidinal style, which is represented metonymically in the C inside by the priest, based on the outright rejection of castration, and underpins all systems of conventional morality, whatever principles are inscribed in their laws. For both Lacan and Derrida, as suggested, genuinely ethical action does not happen in the safe domesticity of law and order, of system and rule, happiness and balance, calculation and the equal distribution of goods, all of which privilege the species as a whole above the individual. Lacan, indeed, rejects the masculine ethic as in principle incompatible with genuinely ethical action and insists upon a necessary turn to the feminine characterized by the acceptance of castration or lack. But the turn to the feminine, as argued, can take two paths. One path leads in a pendulum swing directly to the other pole of the binary, namely, a hysterical fixation upon the transgression of universals, which is another version of fanaticism according to which individuals simply exclude themselves from any form of unity. Since, for Lacan, the masculine and feminine ethics are related in terms of the Velavalianation, neither allows for genuinely ethical action. Notably, there is no clear representative of the purely feminine ethic in the C inside. Lacan argues that both masculine and feminine fixation implicitly but mistakenly deny that the death drive is always aim inhibited, that is, sublimated. By aligning ethical action within the feminine ethic to a revised version of Freud's notion of sublimation, he traces a third path to genuinely ethical action. It is Rosa who takes this path, as I hope to show in more detail. Lacanian ethics enables one to construct an ethical scale that diverges dramatically from the one just discussed in that, inter alia, it reverses the ethical status of Rosa and the priest. Like Antigone and Creon, however, Rosa and the priest are not binary counterparts on Lacan's account of ethical action. The masculine death drive and the ideological paranoia of the priest facing the possibility that being is not all or that being is split such that there are only partial objects. The masculine libido is unwilling to 330 apply this truth of original castration to itself. 18 or, as Silverman puts it, the identification of women with lack functions to cover over the absent real and the foreclosed site of production, losses which are incompatible with the phallic function in relation to which the male subject is defined. 19 rather, on the basis of his discontented perception of a gap between the philosophical ideal of absolute knowledge, goodness, or happiness, and its unsatisfied actual state in living individuals, he retrospectively constructs an imaginary lost plenum that calls for restitution. Caught up in this attitude, he tries to force into being a whole, defined as any universal system within which all parts are contained and ordered, that is adequate to the all, das Ding. In ethical terms, as Lacan puts it, the masculine error of judgment is to promote the good of all as a law without limits. 20 thus deluded, masculine libido pretends to the throne of immortality. The C inside presents two versions of the masculine delusion of immortality. The older delusion, embodied by Derrida, the quadriplegic priest, still dreams the medieval religious dream of returning from a fallen state to the immortal whole, absolute goodness, knowledge, happiness, etc., conceived of as an eternity beyond time. Hence the words he delivers to Ramoen, and since we live within eternity, life doesn't belong to us. It is no accident here that Amenabar constructs the scene of the discursive situation such that these words are whispered from priest to priest and repeated by rote before they are finally delivered to Ramoen. By the simple device of an overly narrow staircase, Amenabar ensures that Derrida cannot meet San Pedro face to face and is obliged to conduct the debate via an envoy, Father Andrea, who carries the words of both quadriplegics up and down the stairs, repeating the main points along the way, to inscribe them in memory. This alienating technique underscores the stereotypical nature of a moralistic rhetoric that, in everyday life, is still regularly passed by rote from priest to parish without the intervention of thinking. One might think that the Enlightenment injunction to surrender the religious dream has put paid to the thought of an immortality beyond these borrowed moments of worldly life. Although, in Kopik's words, officially we moderns are committed to the notion of our own mortality, we nevertheless harbor the secret, inarticulable conviction that we are not mortal. 21 In other words, immortality as a notion has survived secularization well enough, but, at least in our masculine moments, we have refashioned it through a switch that makes of the lost plenum a temporally inscribed ideal to strive for. Masculine libido in a patriarchy is duped by a promised restitution of the good, knowledge, happiness, etc., in an 331 ideal of future fulfillment, which remains relentlessly attractive because he does not believe the truth of origin recastration here. Then, the anticipated immortal whole is no longer understood as belonging to an eternity beyond time. Rather, it progressively unfolds within the life process, and individuals participate in it as the mortal sparks that motor its movement. Further, given that progress is understood as an accumulation of acquisitions that endure beyond the reach of any mortal individual, the immortal whole is identified as the possession of the species. 22 In this case, individuals are exhorted to concentrate on the interests of the species, since this will, in turn, be the best guarantee of individual interests. Assuming, for example, that human evil, ignorance, and suffering are to be gradually eliminated, an individual's best bet, it is said, is to choose in favor of tireless and selfless work in pursuit of the immortal whole, so becoming a willing cog in the universal species machine, which is putatively designed for the ultimate benefit of all humans. 23 In this move, the egotistical jealousy of childhood megalomania is cajoled and bullied into submitting to a formalized fraternal equality. Recall that, for Freud, the guarantee of mutual fraternal recognition was the renunciation of singular desires and the adoption of some version of the social contract here. However, as Kopik notes, we end up depriving ourselves of our own pleasure, choosing instead, for the sake of a more pacific relation to the other, to invest our pleasure in his, lost, cause. 24 Note, then, the veil of alienation, certainly, to choose against the species, and for the individual, is to choose against the individual's prospects for material goods and happiness and, therefore, against the individual. But at the same time, an individual's attempt to participate in immortality through submission to formalized universals is again a matter of self-annihilation. 25 In such annihilation of the individual, a secular state and religious ideology join forces, for both in principle must promote the species over the individual, conformity above singularity, law above critical idiosyncrasy, equality over freedom, paranoiac knowledge over flexible invention, and in so doing, ideally strive to produce dependent individuals who are slaves to the prescribed laws of the state machinery. A persistent motif throughout the inside is the deafness of those who claim to hold some position of institutional authority, backed by conventional morality, to Rameau's persistent request for official recognition of his singularity and respect for the dignity of his ethical autonomy. Taking the form of misrecognition, inflexibility, and the simple refusal to 332 hear his voice, this structural inability to make room for singularity stretches across the religious authority claimed by Derrida, the secular authority claimed by the judiciary, and even the patriarchal authority claimed by Jose, Rameau's older brother and self-proclaimed head of the household. Notably, Amenabar's response to these authority claims is to highlight their irrationality by exposing some of their discursive contradictions. Jose, for example, insists that he wants what is best for Rameau but inflexibly refuses to entertain the idea that this might take the form of the freedom and power to make the choice for death. Further, the words of Derrida, I hear you are laden with heavy irony, since they punctuate the discursive exchange mentioned above, which highlights precisely a lack of communication. This irony is compounded by the content of the interchange where Rameau reflects upon certain contradictions in Derrida's arguments. For example, the very institution that is here so precious about the sanctity of life has a long, bloody history of murder, including burning people alive, in the name of its fundamental principles. Secularization does not remove this contradiction. Ironically, fixated by the just causes represented by ideals of universal human rights, progress, and the sanctity of life, the conventional moralities supported by masculine libido, as much as outright tyrannies and fascisms, regularly demand the torture and execution of those who oppose them. 26 In a secularized state, as Kopik notes, the finite bodies of particular individuals are conceived only objectively in terms of the pervasive risk of injury and death. 27 Preservation of the immortal whole as the succession of bodies requiring protection from injury or unnatural death demands a universal principle endorsing the sanctity of life, and, as she argues, citing Gammon, this means that life exposed to death, bare life or sacred life, is the originary political element. 28 In short, the pervasive risk of injury allows natural life to become the concern of the state, politics becomes biopolitics, and power sinks deep into the minutest aspects of individual life, presiding over every kind of vulnerability, since a universal principle sanctifies bare life above any life of a particular quality. Thus, Rameau is legally obliged to endure a suffering life patiently, for it is required as an endorsement of an abstract, universal principle that protects the sanctity of life. Psychoanalysis explains how people become captated, against reason and often against intuitively held values, by the abstract ideals of a conventional morality, by casting the self-annihilating story of the desire for immortality in terms of the masculine Oedipal drama in which a superego is inscribed in the psyche through identification with the lost parent. 333 Figures. 29 The superego ideal in which the promotion of the good of all as a law without limits finds an ally is formed as that measure of civilization for which individuals ought to strive through sublimation here defined in the sense that predominates in Freud's texts, namely, as the replacement of crude bodily passions, such as sexual urges, for finer pleasures, for an ability of soul the approximation of which is a measure of human progress. Yet the superego characteristically becomes harsher and more demanding the more saintly the subject becomes, for the superego, as argued earlier, is a substitute for an imaginary loss. As Kopik explains, if the superego always demands more sacrifice, more work, this is because the ideal it sets in front of the subject is kept aloft by a loss that the subject is unable to put behind him. 30 In an aggressive turn, then, the masculine death drive aims at an immortal abstraction forever beyond mere worldly objects, for which an individual pointlessly strives, in the process devaluing or negating what actually is. The superego, in Kopik's words, cruelly fosters in the subject a distaste for mundane, compromised pleasures and maintains us in a state of dissatisfaction. 31 But, of course, the anticipated ideal for the sake of which a person must sacrifice the small satisfactions and tolerate the sufferings of the present is only the perpetual promise of restitution in the future. But because the ego can never measure up to the superego, it remains relentlessly and guiltily driven to close the gap between what is demanded and what is actually achieved. The only remedy for such endemic dissatisfaction, one may add, is the paranoid delusion of a quadriplegic priest who knows that life isn't just moving your arms and running around trying to kick a ball. This statement becomes symptomatic of a delusion in its sheer mockery of the body, as if physicality could ever be reducible to activity as comparably inane and ridiculous as football. What Derrida cannot accommodate in his worldview is the singularity of individual differences, for some live more sensually than others. Rameau en San Pedro has been a physical being, a sea adventurer who had traveled the world as a ship's mechanic. His being in the world as a young man had the quality of an intense, voluptuous, sea-sharp sensuality. For him, rendered numb to the sea that had once given him life, his current condition is a limbo, a living death of relentless, yearning suffering. Yet, in his ridicule of bodily pleasure, Derrida attributes Rameau's suffering not to the unavailability of the good but to some form of privation or moral defect, a failure of sublimation or a lack of love. Rameau says he wants to die. But one must wonder. Could Rameau actually be making some sort of plea to society, to all of us for attention? Maybe the people around him, his family 334 can't provide him with the love and support he needs thus, as Copy puts it, by imputing evil to mortal defect or privation, as that which interfered with the full appearance of the good. The various solutions to the problem of evil were designed to leave both the good and God unscathed, and thus, ultimately, justified. 32 Derrida falls silent in the end, not in the comfort zone of sufficiently generalized intellectual arguments, but in front of Manuela's admonishment for this unthinking remark. Given these considerations, one may reassess the ethical status of the priest in the sea inside. While he was given primary position on the scale of virtue represented by conventional morality, his captation by the masculine death drive renders his ethical stance dubious. Feminine transgression, hysteria and eternal irony. The disturber of the masculine peace is not the force of the philosopher's eros that desires something like Hegel's speculative unity of all with all. Rather, it is the inevitable persistence of traumatic interruptions from the constituted outside that will not let the ideological circle close. The repressed forces, the anomalies that have to be ironed out, rationalized away, and glossed over to keep the circle closed inevitably return as disruptive symptoms, slips, gaps, irrationalities, silences, inconsistencies. To avoid the masculine fanaticism that rigidly works to suppress these symptoms and to set out on the path to the ethical act, Lacan insists that one must begin by taking the feminine route, whose initiation rite is to accept that the ineradicability of such symptoms indicates the fact of original castration or lack. Recognizing that the real is lacking, those who adopt a feminine libidinal style testify to the truth that a whole is impossible, that fullness, thought of as the systematic unity of all with all, is merely a retrospective illusion produced by the masculine imaginary. 33 Feminine libido, then, recognizes the lack in any system of conventional morality. It knows that, in Lacan's words, the good cannot reign over all without an excess emerging whose fatal consequences are revealed to us in tragedy. 34 Like the masculine, feminine libido remains dissatisfied with the way things are, and it desires jouissance, ultimate satisfaction, or lack of desire. 35 Ultimate satisfaction also remains constitutionally unavailable, but in a different way. Masculine libido believes that jouissance lies in finally realizing the ideal whole, but its death drive toward the retrospective illusion of this lost ideal is inherently inhibited because it aims at a delusion, which, therefore, cannot ever be realized. Feminine libido, to the 335 contrary, already knows that the world lacks any legitimate ideal that could ground, unify, and organize all of its parts. Feminine libido, in other words, remains open to Nietzsche's radical nihilism, whereby the world seems not inadequate to the ideal but intrinsically inauthentic, made up of an aggregation of particular facts with no underlying support. In a situation where nothing has intrinsic value, no particular object is a measure for any other. Feminine libido, then, automatically indicts existing laws and standards as unfounded and takes on the negative task of breaking down ideals, systems, or wholes, with the aim of forcing the impossible real to appear. Thus, the feminine death drive is characterized as a transgressive drive toward the complete dissolution of the constraining bonds, borders, restrictive barriers, and circumscriptions by which all symbolic objects are constituted according to an accredited inside and an excluded outside. In order to include all that there is without exception, the feminine death drive aims to dissolve all bonds, leaving only fragments or an endless aggregation of parts. However, to try to force the impossible real to appear will bring about, on the other side of masculine fanaticism, another kind of terror, namely the will to utter destruction or the will to a chaotic, schizoid state where nothing stable can ever take hold. 36 Those fixated to the feminine death drive compulsively and relentlessly resist any existing order. In other words, to become hysterical is to become fixated to a non-place in the community and to define oneself, mimicking Hegel, as its eternal irony. A hysteric fixes her desire on remaining on the outside of an unsatisfying reality and must sacrifice every possible worldly satisfaction for its sake, to the extent that if she produces relations in the world, it is only to secure her exclusion from them. Satisfaction, here, twists into the sacrifice of worldly satisfaction to the point that jouissance would entail her total exclusion from the world of the living. To sum up so far, the masculine drive begins as the erotic attachment to a lost plenum but ends as the aggressive exclusion of an outside. The feminine drive begins as erotic, since it can exclude nothing. But since it entails the realization that no whole can form, it becomes thanatic, in its dissolving, destructive sense, as aggression toward the established wholes, and self-aggression as entombment on the outside. Zizek articulates the distinction in terms of a radical split between the masculine jouissance of the drives and the feminine jouissance of the other. 37 The former, he argues, is characterized by the closed, ultimately solipsistic circuit of drives that find their satisfaction in idiotic masturbatory, autoerotic, activity, in the perverse circulating around object as the object of a 336 drive. 38 The latter, by contrast, strives for access to jouissance outside of the solipsistic totality, or, that is, in the other. A feminine hysteric, then, fixated on the sacrifice of her own masturbatory jouissance for the sake of the other jouissance, finds that her enjoyment is entirely alienated or externalized in the other, since it resides only in the effect she has on the other. 39 Her fixation on self-sacrifice, then, becomes just as fanatical as the perverse masculine fixation on the lost jouissance of an unattainable ideal. The masculine and feminine positions are related according to Derrida's agoria or Lacan's veil of alienation, which implies the impossibility of acting ethically if one chooses either. This suggests that the willingness to transgress established orders, which, notably, does not automatically amount to their outright rejection, is a necessary but insufficient condition for ethical action. Such willingness is the necessary condition for making an ethical decision concerning the dictates of an order or rule, for one must be able to assess it independently. Having suspended the rule in order to make a decision, one could well confirm its validity and decide to reinstate it. The point is only that the willingness to transgress allows for the reversal necessary for an ethical act, whereby blind acceptance of the rule does not dictate the decision, but the decision dictates the rule. This relation between transgression and decision suggests the way forward to genuinely ethical action. If the turn to the feminine, which Lacan has already prescribed, entails the acceptance that nothing has intrinsic value, this should not mistakenly be conflated with the belief that nothing, therefore, is of any value. Rather, for Lacan, one may surpass hysterical fanaticism through a transformation that one could call the moment of inventive sublimation. Feminine inventive sublimation, Rosa for Lacan, an ethical act escapes the veil of alienation, the lose of the mugger's choice, for it arises out of a different scene, where the choice is that of the revolutionary, freedom or death. To be sure, to choose freedom on pain of death, to choose to die rather than relinquish freedom, is to lose life. But, on Lacan's account, the lose circle of alienation does not close here, because in dying for the sake of freedom, one does not also lose the freedom. One might immediately object that to call a corpse free is patently absurd. This is the form of Derrida's objection to Rameau's argument in the sea inside. For him, there simply is no freedom to speak of, in the embodied, worldly state, without life as a precondition. This objection, however, rests on the reduction of worldly life and death to mere biological states. By contrast, the revolutionary's 337 choice presupposes an understanding of life that, while worldly and embodied, includes something like the life of the spirit. To be alive in this case requires something more than a biological condition. It requires, that is, some state named by freedom which one could describe as ethical sovereignty, or the power invested in individuals to make their own decisions concerning their singular being in the world. From the point of view of the revolutionary, there is no life without freedom. Even if one is still biologically alive, in the absence of such sovereignty, a person becomes dead in spirit, a living body animated by external command, an automaton. Further, to choose freedom, even on pain of physical death, is to choose life in the sense of spiritual immortality. For, by insisting upon ethical sovereignty, I constitute for myself a singular, irreplaceable, and therefore eternal place in the weave that binds the world together. The revolutionary's choice, therefore, is aligned with the third conception of immortality. Particular individuals who pass away in time relate not only to each other but also to these places in our cultural fabric, which persist over time and provide a weave that keeps the particulars together. 40 To sum up, one chooses the freedom of one's sovereign decisive power, which is also an affirmation of singularity, and one is willing to die for the power to make such a choice. But this does not carry a lose-forward/lose outcome. Freedom so defined is not lost but immortalized, and it remains what it is beyond physical death. Death in the name of freedom gains one the immortality of a Steve Biko or Che Guevara. Does this suggest that one has to be a revolutionary to act ethically? Bluntly, yes. Ethics, for Lacan, belongs neither to the domestic order of conventional morality nor to the chaotic disorder of hysterical transgression. Famous revolutionaries act on a grander scale than the minor revolutionaries of ethical life, but the structure of the act remains the same. In other words, for Lacan, the revolutionary's choice for freedom can certainly be converted into everyday terms, captured in the injunctions to assume your desire or not to cede, give way on, or as to your desire. 41 These by no means simple formulations inscribe incompatible injunctions. Subjects are exhorted, first, to recognize and elect their true desires and to persevere with them to a limit that does not exclude death. But, second, they are exhorted not to persevere in such desires as if they could ever truly represent an essentially traumatic being, but to persevere in desire. This, in an aphoretic twist, means that, having committed oneself to persevere with a desire to a limit that does not exclude death, one must also paradoxically be willing to give it up to reinvention. 338 To make sense of this double injunction, it helps to recall that Lacan structures subjectivity as an articulation of incompatible resistors. On the one hand, in the register of the imaginary, what is called the subject's identity consists in the narrative fiction built up for the ego or MOI. The MOI, represented metaphorically by an integrated mirror image, although it can also be described as a configuration shaped as a response to the other's desire, via unreflectively adopted discourses, ideologies, cultural demands, functions for this reason as an agent of unity, conformity, and fixation, a prosthesis or armor, that, unchecked, is adopted without question or resisted without remedy. On the other hand, in the register of the real, that which I am consists of an unconscious, traumatic, singularizing desire. Granting that a full or absolute uncovering of a traumatic kernel remains impossible, it is still possible to argue that some interpretations are more appropriate than others. Here, then, subjects are capable of self-knowledge to the extent that we can know our desires. Remaining oblivious to such desires, subjects remain beholden to their unconscious vicissitudes. If I fail to recognize my desire, in other words, I do not have it, but I allow it instead to have me. This translates Kopik's succinct formula for one of Lacan's rearticulations of Freud's famous aphorism where S war, sol ich wooden 42 there where it, my desire, was, there must, the ethical must, I, not, ego, but J or subject, become on a Lacanian account, then, the first step toward ethical action, having taken the feminine turn, which recognizes that all MOI values are invented, is to assume your desire. This implies, first, that the J must be capable of uncovering or recognizing something of the impossible desire of its real being. The uncovering of singularizing desire in the register of the real, however, must necessarily occur as a traumatic invasion of the habitual fabric of the subject's MOI identity. To assume a singularizing desire, then, is to allow it its traumatizing effects. Or, put differently, for it is not often a matter of an explicit choice to open the MOI to a desire, in the crisis of its invasion, to assume your desire is first of all to recognize it and, second, to gather the courage to face it. An exemplary case of this invasion of desire occurs in Sophie's choice. As Alenka Zupankaisi argues in her reading of the film version, the extreme and terrible circumstances in which Sophie was forced to act revealed to her the devastating desire that allowed her to choose one of her children over the other. This was a desire she did not want and experienced as a crushing violation. 43 Importantly, harsh as it may seem in relation to the example of Sophie's unbearable desire, Lacan's injunction to assume your desire is an injunction not only to acknowledge the shape of the traumatic desire when it finds you, even if you do not want it, but also to take it up, to decide 339 how to invent its value and how to integrate it into the fabric of your MOI identity. For the consequence of doing nothing, of passively undergoing its traumatic effects, or of repressing them, is spiritual death and ethical paralysis. In other words, facing the disconcerting self-knowledge represented by a singularizing desire, ethical action requires the courage to elect the desire in question, that is, the J is required to take it up or bring it into existence, rather than remain subject to its unconscious vicissitudes. It is important to emphasize here that one first brings desire into existence by articulating it in speech. As Lacan puts it, that the subject should come to recognize and to name his desire, that is the efficacious action of analysis. But it isn't a question of recognizing something which would be entirely given. In naming it the subject creates, brings forth, a new presence in the world. 44 However, he adds that desire and speech are in principle incompatible. In the words of Dylan Evans, it is this incompatibility which explains the irreducibility of the unconscious. Although the truth about desire is present to some degree in all speech, speech can never articulate the whole truth about desire. Whenever speech attempts to articulate desire, there is always a leftover, a surplus, which exceeds speech. 45 To assume your desire, then, is not necessarily to want the desire that characterizes you but to know both that it characterizes you and that you are always irreducible to it. It cannot be denied or disavowed, but one need not allow it to become a tyranny or fixation, since it is always already invented in its articulation through speech, and it can be reinvented. Taking up a desire amounts to a refusal to accept its potentially tyrannizing power and an insistence on retaining the freedom and ethical sovereignty of the J, which allows the subject to put this desire in its place. But, in this case, in acknowledging and taking up a traumatizing desire, in inventing its value, the J cannot but have woven around the traumatic event of its invasion an imaginary identification or defining fiction. In other words, to choose to acknowledge a true desire and to persevere in this choice by taking it up is to risk all over again the opposite tyranny of imaginary fixation. Ethical action, then, necessarily finds itself caught up in an aphoretic circle. There is no ethical action unless subjects find and assume true desires and persevere with them to the last. But in persevering to the last, their actions become not ethical but fanatical. Therefore, subjects cannot act ethically unless they are ready to give up such desires. But if they are ready to give up such desires, they cannot have persevered to the last and therefore cannot act ethically. Usually philosophy views such circular logic as the sign of an error. Lacan and Derrida, however, insist that this circularity represents the facticity of life, and we cannot pretend 340 to dissolve such paradoxes without falling into the ideological trap of the imaginary. All we can do is live through them, negotiating between committed perseverance and obsessive fixation, through persistent but careful reinvention of traumatic desires, taking into account the revisable contexts in which we find ourselves. To conclude this discussion, one could say that Lacan's ethical injunction rests upon his rearticulation of narcissism, which avoids the extremes of masculine paranoia and feminine hysteria. Recall that the death drive in its masculine aspect represents the fruitless striving for a lost plenum, whereas its feminine aspect represents a destructive nirvana. Assuming that narcissism defines the ego's self-love, or, that is, its love of itself as a whole, then under the pressure of the masculine death drive, narcissism describes an impossible ego love, except in self-deception, that depends on matching the ego with the unified ideal of wholeness given by the mirror image. On the other hand, under the pressure of the feminine death drive, narcissism implies a similarly impossible ego love expressed as the pleasure taken in self-shattering in the name of matching the ego with the absolute all. In both cases, if one is honest, one remains endemically dissatisfied with the ego as one of the projected objects of the everyday world and therefore capable of heartless, aggressive, and guilty self-hatred. What both extremisms neglect, however, is that the death drive is always uninhibited. 46 It is stopped temporarily but continuously by the projected objects of desire, objects A, which provide an unending stream of partial satisfactions. This open-ended stream of partial satisfactions provides the key to a conception of sublimation that, for Lacan, replaces the notion predominant in Freud's texts and infuses it with ethical significance. 47 For the most part, driven by superego idealism, sublimation has been thought of in terms of the sublimation of desire, as the translation of crude sexual desire into the higher, more morally acceptable, pleasures associated with producing and contemplating cultural objects such as artworks. The notion of sublimation, however, may be developed in a different direction, suggesting instead that desire sublimates the object. 48 Here, the sublime immortality of everyday objects is to be found precisely in the fact that they do not extinguish desire once and for all. The basic idea here, to reiterate, is that the worldly object, any partial object, gains in value precisely because I love it just for what it is. In this case, it becomes more than what it is, for it becomes the object plus my desire for it, which is both satisfied by it and circulates endlessly around it. Thus, the inestimable value of an object is invented precisely through the restlessness / insatiability of desire. Because my love or interest adds a 341 supplement that allows the object to exceed itself, I tend to reinvent its being as I go along. Iterability is Derrida's name for this paradoxical logic of excess, whereby I repeat the object as just what it is but always with the inestimable difference made by the supplement of my love / interest. Such sublimation, then, allows one to counteract the devaluation of projected objects in the everyday world, including the MOI as object, which derives from the masculine or feminine versions of discontent. It revalues such ordinary objects by discovering their immanent sublimity. Further, inventive sublimations, because they are never static, affect the weave of the worldly fabric in massive or minor ways, after which the weave cannot assume its old shape. If the MOI, as much as another creature or object, is a thing in the world, the act of self-sublimation possible to the autonomous individual turns on the ability to open the MOI to persistent solicitation by the knot of traumatic desire. In this case, the MOI identity becomes an explicitly chosen inventive weave, or text, that interprets and reinterprets the ineradicable traumatic desire. The same immortalizing iterability applies to the invention of a MOI identity, and narcissism here becomes not love of the ego as absolute being nor as absolute non-being in self-shattering, but as a being of lack, as a complex dynamic of being and non-being. This self-sublimation, or invention and persistent reinvention of the MOI is, finally, the shape of the subject's ethical task. In the scene inside, it is the character of Rosa, mimicking the situation of an analysand who undergoes a successful analysis, who offers the example of one who is confronted with the traumatic event of a desire that she neither recognizes at first nor wants. During the course of the narrative, she eventually comes to acknowledge and assume her desire, thus becoming for the first time capable of ethical action. Rosa's narrative of ethical actualization is set in contrast to Julia's progressive ethical disability, for which her physical debilitation to the point of entirely losing her capacity to make any decision at all stands as an appallingly graphic metaphor, for she lacked the courage to uncover and assume her desire, allowing fear instead to dictate her choices. Ramo N plays the part of Rosa's analyst. Here again, Ramo N's physical condition, his almost total paralysis, is metaphorically accurate, for Lacan is clear concerning the limits of psychoanalysis in the ethical domain. It can do no more than help analysands uncover their desires. The tasks of assuming the uncovered desire and of making related ethical decisions if it comes to that remain entirely the analysands. Analysts cannot direct analysands in ethical matters without taking away precisely the freedom that will enable them to act ethically. 342 Rosa is introduced into the narrative in a sharp cut from the words of resignation issuing from Ramo N's father. As long as it's God's will, he'll have to go on living. One observes her from a distance, trimming meat on a factory line, stained to the elbows, and being subjected in her lunch break to some form of castigation by a superior. Reinforcing the impression of an existence that is impoverished, monotonous, degrading, and embattled on all fronts, she ends her day by selecting certain factory scraps and trudging home laden and alone to face an evening of domestic chores. During this time, the voiceover of a television program slowly begins to intrude. It is a documentary made by Ramo N to further his plea for the right to an aided suicide. Gathering up her sleeping child from the couch in front of the television, his voice finally arrests Rosa's attention. Maybe they'll realize this is no excuse for life. Rosa's stunned gaze, over the shoulder of her child, suggests that the letter has reached its destination, but her immediate response is to misrecognize it. She finds herself compelled to seek Ramo N out personally, ostensibly to do some good by convincing him of the sacred value of life, no matter what. However, when Ramo N finally draws from her an admission of why she paid him a visit, her words are telling, for they hardly sound a note of conviction. That's why I came. Why? Well, to make you want to live. To tell you that life what? Isn't it worth it? Ramo N quickly disabuses her of this illusion. Without mincing words, he voices his assessment of the situation. Let's talk about the real reason you're here. About how you're obviously just a frustrated woman who woke up this morning hoping to give her own life some meaning. In other words, what she misrecognizes as her altruistic desire to convince him of the sanctity of life is in fact an attempt to reaffirm her wavering convictions concerning this principle, which have suffered the traumatic shock of her true desire to end her own misery. What he reflects back to her in the mirror of his angry words, then, is that her projection is merely a disguise born of her refusal to acknowledge that she is frustrated with her own life and that what she really desires for herself is a life that is, in her own estimation, worth loving. Yet, conditioned by the ostensibly unquestionable principle of the sanctity of life, she cannot acknowledge her own dissatisfaction, for inscribed in this principle is a moral injunction to accept patiently whatever life one is given regardless of the joys or suffering it might entail. Thus, were Rosa to acknowledge that she desires a life that is, in her own estimation, worth loving, she would concomitantly have to acknowledge that she cannot obey the moral injunction to value life regardless of its quality. There it is, then. Her true desire lies out in the open from the start, waiting for her 343 to recognize it, namely the desire to end her own unsatisfactory existence. Notably, this assessment is retroactively confirmed much later in the film when she admits to Ramo N that it is he who gives her the strength to live. This recognition does not come easily, for it contradicts her deeply held commitment to the sanctity of life. In response to the crisis of Ramo N's assessment, Rosa's first response is to refashion her desire. When she finds in him a man who treats her with compassion, honesty, interest, and patience, in contrast with the rough treatment she experiences from other men, she comes to desire precisely his desire. In other words, in what Freud describes as narcissistic desire, she desires him to desire her. As manifest in her competition with Manuela over his care, she wants to become the loved object that makes his life worth living. Again, this involves projecting the responsibility for her unacknowledged desire for a life worth living onto Ramo N. In effect, she is asking him to desire life in order to underwrite the value of her life. Julia's second visit represents a crisis for Rosa's narcissistic desire. She is forced to face the truth that this desire cannot be satisfied. She will not be the love object that makes Ramo N's life worth living, because his libidinal attention, including a vivid fantasy life, is directed exclusively toward Julia. Concerning the fashioning of her desire, then, Rosa faces difficulties all along the way. Initially she perseveres with her desire for Ramo N's desire. Her attentions become obsessive and excessive, to the desperate annoyance of Manuela. But ultimately she cannot force a recalcitrant reality to comply with her desire, for certain facts intrude too obviously to be ignored. Perseverance to the last in this context promises only suffering. Not only is she obliged to contend with Julia's claim to Ramo N's libidinal affections but, far more seriously, she is forced to face Ramo N's resistance. When she declares her love, Ramo N's response is clear. Rosa, you can't be asking me to stay alive for you. It's too much for me, bear. You call that love? Holding me against my will. The person who really loves me will be the one who helps me die. That's love. Rosa's pained shake of the head indicates that she has not yet recognized her true desire, which, articulated in the terms of the revolutionary's choice, freedom or death, is entirely isomorphic with Ramo N's. Rosa could simply have given up on her pursuit of Ramo N and directed her attentions to finding a substitute satisfaction for her narcissism. That this is something she is evidently unwilling to do, as we discover when she next appears, suggests that something new has happened. Although the film audience is not made privy to Rosa's reflections, we can surmise from her subsequent action that another transformation has 344 occurred in her desire. What she realizes in silence is that she loves Ramo N, and the implications of this love have begun to dawn on her. Through this reversal of her narcissism through love and its power of sublimation, Ramo N becomes more than what he was for her, namely the one whose desires she sought for her own purposes. She comes to understand her narcissism for what it was, a willingness to prolong his suffering because she needed his desire for life to endorse the value of her own. This line of thinking, however, poses a challenge to the moral principle, the sanctity of life, she has been unwilling to question throughout the narrative. By analogy, it reflects a generalized willingness to prolong an individual's suffering because humanity requires, without exception, individual endorsement of a general principle that guarantees the worth of human life as such, regardless of its quality. When Rosa lets go of this principle, she is finally able to acknowledge her true desire. Instead of remaining beholden to an externally imposed moral obligation to desire life no matter what, her true desire is to have a life that is, in her own estimation, worth living, and, conversely, to resist a life, even to the point of death, that is not, in her estimation, worth living. At this point, she can at last empathize with Ramo N. When we next see Rosa, she is a transformed woman. She confesses to Ramo N that she now understands what he has said to her. If you love me, you will be willing to give me up, to help me die. Notably, she has known this all along, not only intellectually, due to the fact that Ramo N has pointed it out to her often enough, but also unconsciously, because the letter reached its destination some time ago at the moment of revelation in front of the television set. Until this point, however, she has been swayed from this truth by a powerful resistance stemming from the dominating effect of the superego, in the form of an unexamined moral conviction adopted in conformity with convention rather than on the basis of independent deliberation. Helped along by the crisis of her frustrated narcissism, Rosa finally takes her distance from the dominating superego, assumes her true desire, and is thereby, for the first time, able to act ethically. This capacity is immediately put to the test. To act upon her rearticulated desire means transgressing conventional morality and facing the terror of an ethical decision concerning the act that conventional morality judges to be criminal. She does not fail this test of perseverance. Yet, of course, this decisive act does not absolve her of a future responsibility to renegotiate the irresolvably aporetic circulation between perseverance and fixation that she will have to live through time and again. 345 concluding remarks. One could characterize Rosa's true desire for a life worth living, as represented in the narrative, as a desire to become an autonomous being capable of ethical action. In realizing this desire, she undergoes a transformation from narcissistic dependence on an external source to affirm life's worth for her to an autonomous readiness to offer the gift of love. This newfound power to make her own assessments of value enables her to suspend a previously unquestioned principle of conventional morality, subject it to critique, and ultimately to decide in favor of transgressing it. But this critical power, in turn, involves the correlative responsibility to invent a singular value for her life. In other words, Rosa, representing all of us, remains a perpetual beginner in the field of ethical action. With her newfound capacities, she only now faces the task of uncovering and assuming her desire, which is the correlate of inventing a singular value that will make her life worth living. We see no more of her in the film and are left guessing concerning what singular value she does subsequently invent for her life. Nevertheless, whatever it is, she will unavoidably have to tread a tightrope. Her newly uncovered and assumed desire will have transgressed, suspended, and reinvented the conventional. But no sooner has it formed a pedestal for the construction of a new life, her very perseverance will put it at risk of becoming a fixated obsession. Thus, for her action to remain ethical, she may, at some point, have to give up this pedestal. To understand her desire as invented means that, as Derrida would say, she is obliged to keep reinventing it, which is to keep subjecting it to the risk of fixation. There is no getting beyond this eternal oscillation. In ethical terms, for example, one cannot simply abdicate the responsibility for making a decision in face of an aporia, the only situation in which a decision strictly speaking becomes necessary and therefore an ethical experience becomes possible, even if it means that one must invent a path, thereby reducing the aporia to something recognizable, namely a problem, and in that sense doing violence to the singularity of the situation and, in effect, ruining one's chance of calling the decision ethical. For Derrida, it is not such a bad thing for a person to recognize the impossibility of ever living up to the dream of genuine ethicality, as long as this lack is not given as grounds for abdication but for persistent love directed toward the impossible. In conclusion, one may pose a final question: did Rosa act for the sake of the good? Or, is there room in Derridean /Lacanian ethical discourse for an assessment of the singular invention of value in terms of good or evil? Clearly, it would go against the grain of an argument for the aporetic 346 structure of the real to suggest that Lacan's model allows for any absolute and final measure of the good. Instead, one may address this question along the following lines. If the invention of value is singular, it simultaneously does not fall from the sky but reconfigures the weave of conventional morality in massive or minor ways. Recall that an invention of singular value creates an immortal place in the fabric of human life that survives individual death and in relation to which others orient their own actions. In its realization through action, then, one automatically exposes a singular invention of value to the risk of publicity and to the intersubjective test of the good. At best, then, its status as good or evil is decided retrospectively, and periodically subjected to context-specific revisions in the public domain through intersubjective debate. This is, admittedly, hardly a satisfactory or stable measure of good or evil, but the alternatives, of rigidly law-governed conventional morality or amoral relativism, risk the far greater terrors of ethical fanaticism. Rosa, then, will constantly have to negotiate the ethical status of her invented value. She, like all of us, will never once and for all be an ethical person.